I'll be very honest with you. It's been far too long since I made a trip to Israel. For a variety of reasons, I have yet to return to our people's spiritual homeland since I spent my first year of rabbinical school there in 2016 and 2017. And though they may have faded a bit in my memory after so many years, there are special moments that emerge at different times over the course of the Jewish calendar year. And in preparation for tonight, I remembered yet another moment, similar to the one I shared in my first ever sermon from this pulpit way back all the way in July of 2023. And it happened when I was coming out of a seminar, a class I was taking at the Shalom Hartman Institute in the German colony. And just across the way, there was a small public park filled with a variety of small bonfires. Not typically something you would see in a public park. Certainly not something I would have seen during my years in California. And not only were there bonfires, there were families, communities gathered with singing, children playing with many different toys, but especially small toy bows and arrows. And on my walk home to my apartment, I noticed that this was a common scene. You could see it throughout the city. I could see the light of the flames from the bonfires, you could smell the flames, and you could hear the singing and the dancing. Come to find out, this night was, in fact, a minor Jewish holiday, Lag BaOmer, a day of celebration and song that occurs on the 33rd day of the Omer, and the Omer being the 49-day period between the beginning of Passover and Shavuot. And Lag BaOmer this year will begin tomorrow evening. Now, the rejoicing on the 33rd day of the Omer stands in contrast to the days preceding and following it, which are treated as a sort of mourning period by many Jews. There are many explanations for why mourning practices, that's mourning with a U, not mourning as in the time of day, why these practices became common during this time frame between Passover and Shavuot. But one of the most famous is that in remembrance of the 12,000 students of Rabbi Akiva who perished during the season nearly 2,000 years ago. The Talmud explains that a plague descended upon the students, mipnei shelo nahagu kavod ze lazeh, because they did not treat one another with respect. And so, all this time later, we continue to mourn those students of Rabbi Akiva and the generation of scholars they represent until the day when the plague is alleged to have ended, the 33rd day of the Omer, Lag BaOmer. Now, this reprieve in a period of mourning is, in fact, a curious one. Jewish tradition has a keen awareness of the societal and the psychological components of dealing with grief. We have many different rituals and customs that encourage us to sit with our grief, not to come out of it for these periodic moments. And that's why they are prescribed. We are taught that we are to move from the depths of the first 7 days after a loved one's death to a gradual reconnection with the community and outside world after 30 days, shloshim, and eventually a full reintegration into the wider community after a year. These customs, while perhaps for many of us burdensome, force us to confront the losses we suffer, the grief, the anger, the sadness, the despondency, and all the many ways we react to and process such losses. In confronting them, rather than shoving them to the side, we are able to move through them, to fully experience their tempestuous waves, and eventually let these waves pass. Hopefully acknowledging that they no longer hold the power over us that they once did. So the gradual process of Shiva, first 7 days, shloshim, and the 11-month mourning period that follows allows us, in fact, forces us to deal with our grief, and most specifically, to not let our grief consume us. But what does it mean to emerge from grief? I think it's safe to say most of us would not think of it quite as a celebration, as is the case with the special holiday of Lag BaOmer, or even as is in the case in the typical transition in Israel from Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, straight into Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. But it is an important question nonetheless, one that we must all grapple with at some point in our lives. Because the truth is that we cannot live in perpetual mourning. To do so is to allow this grief to dominate us, to give it a power it should not hold, the power to impact every aspect of our lives, our relationships, how we see and how we treat people. Of course, it is a delicate balance to allow ourselves to feel grief fully and at the same time not allow it to dominate us. Why do I bring this up? We have been a people in continual grief, an ambiguous, powerful sort of grief that began on October 7th and has only deepened by the war that has followed and continues to claim the lives of so many. We are a people in a suspended sort of grief, collectively feeling the anxiety and uncertainty the past and the future holds for more than 100 innocent civilians still held hostage in Gaza. Now, the recent recovery of some of those hostages, or at least some of the remains of those hostages, have brought a little bit of closure to their families. May God send them comfort and strength. But as a people, as a worldwide family, we are caught in this tragic limbo, unsure where one mourning period ends and another begins. Now, I'm not advocating that our mourning period should end. Certainly not as this war rages on, as the fate of the hostages remains in the balance. And as we are not yet even a year since that Black Shabbat this past October, the reality is we are very much still within the storm of grief, as we should be. Instead, I want to pose the question that I hope I am not alone in grappling with in recent days. What is waiting for us on the other end of this grief? I do not know when this war will end, when the hostages will, God willing, return to their families. I do not know when we will stop from checking the news every day, holding our breaths as we pray for a glimmer of hope, but also brace ourselves for yet more tragedy. And I do not know what will emerge in Israel and Gaza after the dust settles. What I do know is that we cannot live in a constant state of mourning, because grief does not bring out the best in us, our hope, our compassion, our commitment to building a better world. Instead, unchecked grief can easily consume us, leading us to forsake the better angels of our nature. So perhaps this is the lesson that Lag BaOmer may teach us this year, that even in periods of mourning, we must allow for moments of reprieve, when we can enjoy the gift of living, we can appreciate the light that still exists in the world, and connect with those things, those people, those places in our lives that bring out that life more fully. Certainly, we have a long road ahead of us as we make our way through our grief. And there's no telling what lies at the destination. But our tradition teaches us that we must not forsake hope, tikva, even in the face of darkness and even in the face of hatred and destruction. So we will continue to walk together, leaning on one another, sharing this burden of loss and mourning, and continue to pray for the day when that storm of grief has passed, and that despite all odds, we made our way through it together. And, God willing, that we will emerge into a world closer to wholeness and peace, that peace within our hearts, the peace within our people, and the peace amongst all peoples. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.